My name is Dan Prax. I'm coordinator for the annual country study program, and this year, with the Year of Russia, we've had a great participation and strength and support from faculty across the campus, but in particular, not just with the Year of Russia, but year after year, the economics faculty have been great collaborators and partners with the Year of program. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Tim Matthews, who's in the economics department and has helped spearhead that support for learning about the world. And thank you, Tim, for all that you do.
Great, thank you, Dan. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dr. Boettke, for coming down from Washington today. I'd also like to thank the Charles Koch Foundation for providing the funding for Dr. Boettke's visit to Kennesaw State University today as part of the Koch Foundation's efforts to support the study of free societies and the institutions that maximize human well-being. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Pete Boettke. He's a university professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University, the BB&T professor for the study of capitalism, and the director of the F.A. Hayek program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Dr. Boettke is a world-renowned academic who currently serves as the president of the Southern Economic Association and the Mont Pelerin Society. He has written over 140 academic journal articles and several books, including The Political Economy of Soviet Socialism, The Formative Years 1918 to 1928, Why Perestroika Failed, The Economics and Politics of Socialism Transformation, and Calculation and Coordination, Essays on Socialism and Transitional Political Economy. The title of his talk as part of our Year of Russia today is Soviet Economic History and the New Economic Policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Boettke to Kennesaw State.
It's a great honor for me to be here to give this talk and to support this outstanding program that you have here at the university. So I hope for all of you that you take full advantage of this. This is a great opportunity for learning and what, not my lecture, but the program in general. And this also is an opportunity for me to return to my roots as an academic. So my doctoral dissertation was on the Soviet economic history, and I spent the first decade and a half of my career devoted to those topics. And then I sort of shifted out of that into development economics more generally, and then some other areas of economics. But I've always had a sort of foot back in, but it's very hard with Russia because things are constantly shifting. And so my knowledge of this is historical, and I have a good thing here, which is that I actually am being asked to give a talk about Russian history. Now, unless history changes with new data, new discovery, but a lot of the new discoveries all took place when I was really involved in all this because the archives were opened up, and the archives revealed a story about the Soviet history which was much more consistent with what critics of the system had believed than those who were advocates of the system. So the numbers I'm going to give you here are actually in the medium range of numbers, okay? So I'm not going to give you the extreme numbers when I get to sort of the bad side of things, but I'm going to give you some of the medium range numbers just so you have that. But there's Yale University Press published a ton of little books examining all of the new archive material that was opened up after the Soviet Union collapsed, which is very relevant. Now, this is kind of directed to the students, but in 1987, I was a graduate student. Soviet Union hadn't collapsed yet. Communism didn't collapse in East and Central Europe yet. All right, so these things were still live systems. But in all of Russia, Soviet Russia, they suspended the history exams in high school that year because under Gorbachev's proposal plan policies were twofold: perestroika, which meant restructuring, and glasnost, which was opening up. Well, when they opened up and they started examining things, they had to re-examine their own history books about actually these events that's going on now. And they didn't know what to teach. So they suspended the history exams that year. Okay, that's actually a true story. It's not made up. All right, they didn't know what to teach. And part of this is to understand the role of propaganda and everything else in the way that the party orchestrated history. And so you can read, like, say, for example, different party congresses, and they were rewritten and then rewritten and then rewritten again to make sure that the story was the one that whatever was in charge of, had. So it's kind of fascinating. I'm going to try to go through. A lot of this is as I said, based on this research from the archives that's been opened up, as well as my own work. All right, so what are the main points I'm going to try to get across here in an hour? One, socialism circa 1917 meant something, and what it meant was the abolition of private property and the establishment of comprehensive planning, a rationalization of production. It didn't mean just nice things. It had a very specific meaning, and that led to very specific policies that were going to be adopted. Okay? The Soviet experience is the greatest social experiment of the 20th century. It's an experiment in totality. So there's still lessons for us to learn tremendously about this. By the way, for those of you who want to get a sense of this in a very kind of down-to-earth way, about a year ago on NPR, they ran a series on what was called Soviet kitchens. All right, and so you can go to NPR, type in Soviet kitchens. It relates to when there was the great kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon. And when Khrushchev says, "We will bury you," he doesn't mean militarily. He means economically, a variety of choices or whatever. And then they started debating about what was going on in Soviet kitchens. But what's fascinating about this story is the explanation of what happened when you substitute private dining to communal dining, which took place in a lot of the apartments that were built after the revolution, what the whole purpose of that was and everything. And so it's a great window into like the social aspects of this, not just the narrow economic ones. But that's what we mean by this totality project. Between 1917 and 1921, socialism in its strictest meaning of the term from the first bullet point was in fact tried to be implemented and failed, as economists had predicted would happen. Between 21 and 28, socialism in practice was abandoned for the promise of socialism in future. That's the new economic policy. All right, in 28, the claim of socialism in practice was made, but only in changing the original meaning of socialism. And so what happens is Soviet socialism post-1928 is all about regime survival, power and regime survival, none of the aspirations of the earlier revolutionary period. In 85, and what you have during this period, which I can't do here, but from 53 forward, you have a perpetual treadmill of Soviet reforms. Every few years is another attempt to try to have reforms that then get supplanted by another set of reforms on the economic front. From 85 onwards, Gorbachev, you have perestroika, which is in fact another new economic policy. 85 is a kind of a fascinating year in general, because that's also when Deng Xiaoping in China announces it doesn't matter what color the cat as long as it catches the mouse. So a lot of people date the post-Mao reforms. I'll try to go through this really quickly because it's about China, not Russia. But in 1978, Deng Xiaoping comes to power, and the belief is that they're going to have socialist accountability. And so the first thing that Deng Xiaoping did was he allowed the workers to choose their own plant managers of the state firms. Now, what do you think those managers ran on? Wage increases, okay? And so what happened between 1978 and 1985 is you actually exacerbated the budgetary problems that were confronting the China regime. So in 1985, Deng Xiaoping announced it doesn't matter what color the cat as long as it catches the mouse. And that's when he switched and went to a regime of what's called reverse revenue sharing, where he said to the state enterprises, you have to pay us a fixed amount, but then you get to keep the surplus. So now Beijing wasn't going to be subsidizing, right, the firms. The firms were going to be kicking back to Beijing. It's the same tax system, by the way, that we had under the Articles of Confederation. All right, which is a different kind of system. And you're going to see this is the key policy move that Lenin makes in 1921 as well, which is to eliminate arbitrary taxation and establish a fixed tax. And that's the first of the new economic policies that was done. But this year is a kind of fascinating year. And if you read about anything having to do with Gorbachev or whatever, you know, they just got to a point where they understood that they couldn't continue to live like this, right? And so that's one of the reasons why they had the impetus for the reforms. But let's go now on a little trip down in history. Have you seen the movie Reds? Okay, some only older people, but if you haven't, go see the movie Reds. It's a great movie. It's Warren Beatty, you know, and whatnot. It's about John Reed. John Reed is the only American buried in the Kremlin. John Reed was a journalist from the West Coast. He went and covered World War I, and then he went and covered the Russian Revolution, and he was an advocate of the Russian Revolution. And he then became a propagandist for the regime and then died, and he was buried in the Kremlin wall. And John Reed wrote a famous book, which sort of into the English-speaking world was the book that described the Russian Revolution to everyone. It's called 10 Days That Shook the World. And John Reed describes the scene when Lenin comes into power and he grabs the podium and he just says, now we will construct socialism. And then he moves on. And so this is Lenin speaking in front of the crowd, not by the way in 1917, but what I want to do is sort of give you some background. I hope that you can read these. I don't know if you can, but I'm going to walk through them. But these are the decrees that were adopted. So let me be clear about something first. What it meant to be a socialist economy was the abolition of private property and the means of production. There's two radical criticisms of capitalism that come out of the socialist doctrine. One of them, all right, is that capitalism suffers from or forces us to be alienated. All right? Alienation in the Marxist lingo is not, oh, I'm just depressed at my job. All right? Alienation is that you are separated from your nature. You're separated from yourself. You're separated from nature itself. Okay? We are alienated beings. Right? The other criticism is exploitation. All right? So the trick about Marxian socialism, as opposed to evolutionary socialism or reformist socialism that took place in different parts of the world, is that it was only through abolition of private property, that is, only by transcending our alienating being, that we could, in fact, get rid of the exploitation. All right? So to give you a kind of more colorful example, Marx himself said about money that trying to abolish money without trying to abolish commodity production would be similar to trying to abolish Catholicism by getting rid of the Pope. What's wrong with that? Right? What you really want to do is get rid of Catholicism and then there's no need for a Pope. That's the Marxist idea. Get rid of commodity production and then all these other institutions will go away. What makes commodity production possible is what? Private ownership. So that's why I have to go after private ownership. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to knock out private ownership, and instead what I'm going to substitute for it is collective ownership with, in fact, not production for exchange, right, which is what we do, production for exchange and profit, but instead production for direct use. And that's going to be guided by an administrative apparatus of planning. This plan is not unconcrete. Okay, this is a big issue in history, is whether or not socialism has a concrete planning. A lot of people believe Marx gave us criticism of capitalism, but in fact didn't give us an image of what socialism should be. But that's not actually right. It's a failure to understand Marx's own methodology. Marx was a dialectician, and so therefore the way you describe scientifically the future is through a critique of the present. That's part of what the methodology is all about. Negations of negations and other kinds of things which now get into philosophy we don't want to talk about. So now let's get concrete. Right? Now we will construct socialism. So they do this. So what's the first act that they do? The Council of People's Commissars is formed. Second act that they engage in, they abolished the landlord's right to property and called for the confiscation of landed estates. Okay, so another movie, Dr. Zhivago. Book, movie, anyone here? Come on, some of you, right? Dr. Zhivago, The Fate of Yuri, right? This is what's going on in that movie, right? All right, decree on the worker controls over production. All right, so Soviets, Lenin describing what he was going to do was he was going to combine German war planning with Soviet democracy. Okay, so during World War I, the Germans got to be known for having this very efficient military planning operation. And so I'm going to combine that with Soviet democracy. What did that mean? Well, Soviets is a word, it's basically like worker control councils. So all these councils are going to have this kind of ability to have this democracy. So you combine the German war planning with the Soviet democracies, in Lenin's mind, that's going to bring us paradise, okay? So decree on workers, worker control over production. Supreme Economic Council is formed. Right? You're going to nationalize all the banks. No, this is in the first, remember how we're going to have an administration come in and everyone's going to talk about the first 100 days. This is what's going on, okay? Dividend interest payments and all dealings in stocks and bonds are declared illegal. Declaration of the rights of the working exploited people to abolish exploitation of man by man. My Russian economics teacher was, his mother was a big dissident, Ludmila Alexeyev, if any of you have ever read her book. It's called The Thaw Generation. She wrote the book about the 1956 generation after. Anyway, Mike Alexeyev was my teacher. He's now a professor at University of Indiana. And he always used to say, under capitalism, man eats man. Under socialism, it's the other way around. So that was like his little joke here. But, all right, Declaration of the Rights of the Working and Exploited People abolished exploitation of man by man. February, repudiation of all foreign debt. April, nationalization of foreign trade. May, abolition of inheritance. Okay. June, and again in May, decree giving the food commissary extraordinary powers to combat the village bourgeoisie. These were people growing the food in the villages and bringing it to the city because the city didn't have food. And so they were trying to make a profit, and we were going to stop them now. Okay? Civil War. I just want to point this out. This is going to become an important part of my story. Okay? So June, this is when they mobilize, all right, for the Civil War. Okay, so there's labor mobilization for the Red Army. Nationalization of large-scale industry and railroad transportation. November 1918, decree on the extraordinary revolutionary tax to support the Red Army, meaning the Red Army could confiscate whatever they needed. Okay? Now this is important because Lenin rose to power, all right, on an agreement between the peasantry, all right, and the workers. All right? And that gets broken because now the party is now exploiting the peasants. Okay? Now, remember they labor mobilized. So what happened was they took the kids from the villages and they put them in the army. When those kids came back home, as we'll get to very shortly, they came home to families that have now been depleted, which meant that they hated the regime. So that's going to force another political move that needs to be made. Okay? Party program of the 8th Party Congress. Keep in mind the name Nikolai Bukharin. Nikolai Bukharin is the architect of the economic policies during this period, and he's the architect during the economic policies of the period we're going to get to in a second. So they're going to increase centralization of economic administration. March 1920, the outstanding resolution of economic reconstruction is passed. Increased centralization again. November 1920, decree of the Supreme Economic Council on the nationalization of all small industrial enterprises. So we've already had large-scale nationalization. Now we're going to nationalize all the small ones. Now understand how small. Right? All enterprises with mechanical power who employed 5 or more employees. You're now nationalized. Okay? all enterprises without mechanical power who employ 10 or more workers, you're now nationalized. So we've just nationalized all the way down to firms with only 5 employees. Think about how many firms that is. You're nationalizing this entire economy. March of 1921, remember what I said about the peasants coming back? This is the Kronstadt Rebellion. We're going to now have to sort of fix it. And now you get the Soviet system. This is the founding of the Soviet system. Look at what the next 2 decrees are. First decree, suppression of all dissent. No longer a party of oppositions that have to clash out and debate. If you oppose us, you either are deported or you're dead, or you agree with us. And now we're going to retreat on economics, and we're going to establish a fixed tax rather than arbitrary tax, and we're going to introduce new economic policies. So the key points of what I just went over is the decrees before June of 1918, which is before the outbreak of the Civil War. So did they centralize because of Civil War? Countries at war always centralize. The reason for this is very simple. The economic problem that society confronts is how do you allocate scarce resources among competing ends? All right? That's a bad way to sort of mobilize for a war, because the war would have to compete against other ends that you might pursue. So one of the things countries do is they suppress the multiplicity of ends to one end, win the war. All right? And then it just becomes a technological problem, which is how do I, among the multiple arrays of possible ways to win the war, what's the best way to do it? Right? By plane, by ground, by whatever, right? It becomes a pure strategic problem. And so they suppress the economics, and they end up by, trying to just make it a technological problem. Right? This is why countries do through centralization. So did they centralize because they were fighting a war? Well, here's the problem with that hypothesis, is that they centralized well before the Civil War started. And they continued to centralize the nationalization down to the 5 employees. That's after the Civil War is over. And they continued. So the war emergency influences the way policies are introduced, but not the policies themselves. The policies themselves at this earlier period are motivated by the revolutionary ideology. Well, what was the consequences of this? All right, so if we take this as our base standard, what you can see here is a collapse on your right-hand side. That collapse is worse than the Great Depression. Right? It's a collapse of an economy. All right, that goes on. So your output of all industry falls from if that's your base year, it fell all the way down to 30%, basically. That's a 70% collapse of the economy. All right, this is what's going on. This is Venezuela today. All right, that's what's going on when you see the empty shelves and everything going on in Venezuela. This is the kind of consequence that you had here. All right. But it's worse. What are the consequences in terms of human rights? Well, the Civil War casualties are estimated somewhere between 7 million to 12 million. Mostly civilians, the casualties of war. But we also have the Red Terror, which is political suppression carried out by what would later be the KGB, the original organization. We estimate that between 1917 and 1921 at around 1.5 million executions. Okay? So this is kind of tough stuff to refer to the revolution. Now, remember what I said. The new economic policy was we're going to suspend socialism today for the promise of socialism in the future. All right, so this is declining production, declining consumer welfare, declining freedoms, right? We've already seen all of that. Question you have to ask is why? Why these consequences from this high aspirations? And I want to suggest the following, and I'll come back to this again. There's multiple hypotheses that you can entertain. All right, so let me repeat those hypotheses because I'm going to say them at the end of my talk as well, which is you could simply say bad leaders. It was just unfortunate that they got bad leaders. So how many here have read the book 1984? Right. Okay, I love all of you. You read 1984. How many of you know that that book is an allegory to Russia and Soviet revolution? All right, so good. So we have some people that know this. Not everyone gets this. So, you know, all the characters, like, so Boxer, the faithful horse, right? He's actually Nikolai Bukharin, all right? And then what you have is you have Snowball, a little pig, and he's like a funny, nice little piggy, too, piggy, right? That's actually Trotsky, all right? And then you have Napoleon, right? And Napoleon is Stalin, right? These are the pigs in the story. So what happens? You have old Major, who's Marxist-Leninism. He's the big fat pig in the beginning. And he teaches the revolution to the poor farm animals who are working harder and harder and all these things like that. And then what happens is they're going to have an industrialization project. And that's Trotsky's idea, Snowball's idea. Going to big the windmill and make life good for all the animals on the farm. And Stalin, Napoleon, fights him. Okay? And in the meantime, Napoleon's been training, what? The little dogs on the farm. He raises them as puppies, and they're like these little like Rottweilers, right? And so then what happens is he unleashes them on Snowball. And Snowball gets chased off all the way presumably to Mexico, where then he's killed by a murderer with an ice pick. That's what happened to Trotsky, okay? And I'm not laughing because of the thing. You know, it's tragic, but I'm kind of putting some levity, trying, on a tragic story. And then he takes over the farm, and then he rebuilds the windmill, right? And makes it now even his. So he adopted the policy, moved up, and did all this stuff. So in a few minutes, you're going to hear all of these kind of the stories here. But what if, so one of the ways you could read that novel is you come back and you say, but what if just Snowball would have won? Wouldn't it have been nice? Well, let's like go back a little history. March 1921, the Kronstadt Rebellion. Who was the head of the Red Army? Trotsky. He is as ruthless as any leader in military affairs ever of what he does to the people here. So he's not actually like warm, fuzzy Snowball. All right. All right, so 1, bad leaders. 2, bad timing. Right? Isn't Marxism, doesn't it say that you have to be advanced capitalism before you can leap into socialism? Otherwise, you get stuck in Asiatic despotism. Right? Isn't that the way that the synthesis, right, and you know, antithesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis sort of marches in the dialectical materialism? All right. Here's the problem with that thesis. Russia in 1917 was the 5th largest industrial economy in the world. Now, it was a mercantilist economy, all right? And it did have this weird kind of thing where it had a large peasant economy tapped onto a mercantilist economy. But it was more developed than France was in 1848, all right? Where Marx, in fact, called for revolution in France in 1848. So it's a hard thing to do. And then the third one, and I'm sure there's some other hypotheses that you guys could talk about. Maybe we can talk about those. But here's a third one. Socialism fails because it's a bad economic system. It fails because its economic system, ends up by creating difficulties which then lead to the political issues. And that's what I'm going to kind of walk through here. So why? So the number one thing is that socialism fails to have the ability to engage in rational economic calculation of alternative investment projects. Okay? That means the system is going to be filled with systemic waste and all kinds of inefficiencies. Now, how does that go? You need to have private property in the means of production to be able to have a market for the means of production. Without that market in the means of production, you're not going to get prices for those means of production. Without prices as relative scarcity indicators, you're not going to be able to engage in rational economic calculation about whether or not to use, let's say, platinum. If I just said to you, hey, we're going to build a railroad, we have a choice. We can build it out of platinum or we can build it out of steel. Let's all vote for platinum. What do you think? What's the first thing going to come out of your head? Right there. What would you say? Right there with the gray. I'm looking at you. Yeah. I'm going to build it out of platinum. Do you know what platinum is? Yeah, but is it expensive or cheap? No, it's really expensive. It's like diamonds, right? So it's like, let's build railroads out of diamonds or something, right? So it's really expensive. You would say that. But what if you didn't know what expensive was? Everyone understand this? If you don't have prices, you don't know whether or not something's expensive or not. It just is. So why wouldn't, now here's the thing. Platinum, the reason why I use that example, platinum technologically would actually be a better metal to build a railroad track with. It's smoother, has greater longevity, all kinds of things like that. But we would never build railroad tracks out of platinum because it's like through the roof expensive. So we just wouldn't do it. But what if we didn't know that? We wouldn't know what the alternative uses are. That's what the problem of rational economic calculation is. Rational calculation allows us to choose from the array of technologically possible projects those which are economically viable. And that's why we're able to constantly have economic growth and development. You can't have economic growth and development in systemic waste. So this isn't just a trivial thing. You're trying to make sure that you can sustain the population. Standard of livings are improvements of the standard of livings for ever-growing populations. That's what Adam Smith thought was great, how you want judge societies or whatever. Socialism didn't promise us to be paupers. Remember, it was a rationalization project. The belief is that we would have a rationalization of production that would be a burst of productivity far greater than anything we've ever seen before. We would move from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. That was the promise. Rational calculation says that move's not possible. The inability to calculate doesn't allow you to do that. In fact, makes you even more of a kingdom of necessity. And so that's why this is such a linchpin argument. Here's another one, a little less generous. It's just an incoherent idea. All right, so what do I mean by that? You have means and you have ends. Here's the ends. You're going to take these means. Now, are those means sufficient? Now, imagine, look at me, okay? I used to be a college athlete. I didn't always used to look like this, okay? I won an award from my college many years ago, and the first person I saw when I went to campus was my old coach. And the first thing my coach said was, "There's a college athlete who's kept himself in tip-top shape." And I felt like saying things that I never said to him when I was playing for him. But, I shook his hand and took it, and everything like that. But imagine if I said to you, you know what, I'm training for the 100-yard dash. Right? That's what I'm doing. I'm taking on Usain Bolt. And then you sat down with me, and for dinner, what I ate was 5 chocolate cakes. And I said, this is tackling fuel. I'm eating these chocolate cakes, and give me a milkshake, and I'm going to town. I'm taking on Usain Bolt. You would say, wait a minute, that's your means. Your end is to beat Usain Bolt. Your means is to have that tackling fuel. Something incoherent about that project, right? Doing those things. So this is the kind of thing with socialism, is that the very means that are chosen are incoherent with respect to the end sought. So you can judge social systems under 3 kind of ways with this means-ends efficiency issue, which is what economists do. All right? You have means, you have 2 tests. One of them is a means-ends efficiency, and the other one is a vulnerability to opportunistic behavior. So, are the means sufficient to obtain the ends? Let's say we pass that test. Yes. Then the second question is, are those rules opportunistic? Can opportunistic agents undermine those rules through their rational choices? All right? A truly coherent and viable system has to both pass the means-ends test and be invulnerable to opportunism. Okay? Socialism fails on both fronts. It is means-ends incoherent, and because it gives power to people who are now entrusted, they can use it opportunistically to benefit themselves. So the very idea of collective ownership is incoherent because someone has decision rights. So an old Russian joke is, what I watch is what I own. It's not, they didn't own it, they didn't have legal rights to it, but what I watch is what I own. I'm going to make sure I use it for my, what's going to be good for me. Which, by the way, on their economic system, led to another Soviet joke, which was a state shortage of buns and a state shortage of sausage leads to a sandwich sold out the back window. Okay? So the whole history of the Soviet system is also, come on in, is also a system of other colored markets. So it's not like markets were suppressed. They just were, you know, like they would squash them down over here and then they would spurt up over here. They're like weeds. Markets are like weeds. And so that's even true. In the 1980s, it was estimated at one time that the market for gasoline in Moscow, 80% of the gasoline sold and bought in Moscow was done in the black market, not in the official market. Official market was all full of shortages. So what we have to do is we have to think about control rights and cash flow rights. And so in a Soviet-type system, you have control rights but no cash flow rights. This is very important, not that we'll get to it today, but when we think about privatization in the post-communist period, because it wasn't that you were starting with no property rights. You already had control rights. Now the question is how do you get them to recognize the cash flow rights, and how do you get them to reallocate the rights? Which is one of the reasons why in Russia, so you asked me the question earlier about comparative performance. And one of the questions that's kind of interesting about that is comparative privatization methods. So do you do insider deals with privatization? That leads eventually to the oligarchs, right? Or do you do deals with like mixed ownership type? Do you do a voucher system? You know, you have all these different privatizations. Which one in those horse races have actually done better? It turns out a lot of times, at least when you slice the data, sometimes it's like the insider deals. Like I gave you the existing managers the existing rights. Problem in Russia was that those guys used it right away to then create new barriers to entry rather than to reallocate the resources, which maybe you could have done. So my preferred policy, JC will understand this, comes right out of public choice, is to figure out the present value of the future income stream of the rents that were due to the different party bosses. This is papers, Tim, that I did with Gary Anderson, actually. Then what you should do is figure that out and then give them a one lump sum like transfer and then tell them to disappear, right? And that would be less costly than what we did in terms of all the efforts to try to do the reforms and stuff, but that didn't get adopted. Very rarely does. And the reason why it doesn't, this is too insider baseball to the professors here, but the reason why it doesn't is because of Asimoglu's there is no political coast theorem. You can't commit to making the payment. So as a result, since they know that, they're going to cheat then on the other one. So, all right, so socialism and Prax. This is the thing that I think that you should focus on here. So there's a famous book called The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek. And what Hayek argued in that book is that the totalitarian aspects of socialism are an unattended, undesirable consequence of a dream aspiration that goes awry because it confronts a refractory reality. Okay? Now, what do I mean by that? So, I'm going to centrally plan my economy. I can't engage in economic calculation. So, how am I going to make the decisions? Well, here's what I can make the decisions on. I can reward my friends and punish my enemies. That's a very clear set of political signals. And so that's what I end up by doing. So I create loyalists that are then going to rule in my interest, and that's what I use the resources of the purse of the state to do, is to reward my friends and punish my enemies. And then that's why the system becomes one of perpetual trying to regime survival rather than trying to achieve economic goals. Now, there are certain economic goals that had to be met. So, for example, you promised industrialization. So, what did they do? They industrialized, right? They had to build a military state. So, what did they do? They built a military state. And, you know, everyone points and says, look, within a short period of 25 years, they went from a peasant economy to be able to defeat Hitler. You know, you can't deny that they did that. However, what you should look at is at what cost did they do that? And you can't be as unaffected with those costs as people want you to be. There's an article in the Journal of Political Economy when I was a graduate student that actually drove me nuts because the author said Stalin increased per capita GDP, and then he has a footnote, and it says, at the great loss of human and livestock population. So, this is the model for economic development. Increase per capita GDP by cutting the denominator. That's not a model for growth, okay? And yet, you know, as a value-free scientist, I can't say, no, you can say something, all right? The millions of people that are sacrificed to this do not pay, do not deserve that. And where is that from? It's because we substitute political criteria for economic decision-making precisely because we can't engage in the kind of economic decision-making which the task requires us to do. All right. So we come to 1921, life is a mess. Lenin has to admit. So this is in a speech that Lenin gives called The New Economic Policies and the Tasks of Political Education Departments. Look at that name even, Political Education Departments. This goes back to my propaganda thing. So I was asking you about art and stuff because I have all these art books from Soviet art. I'm actually fascinated by propaganda as a political economy thing. But if you look at like what they did, art in service of the state, independent of the fact that they also did produce great art, but they also did this art in the service of the state. You could do a whole program on that, you know, just showing the same pictures from the revolution or whatever and who the heroes were. It's pretty amazing. And attempting to go straight over into communism, we, in the spring of 1921, sustained a more serious defeat on the economic front than any defeat inflicted upon us by military defeat. This defeat was much more serious, significant, and dangerous. It's right out of the horse's mouth. And so here's the guy who takes over. Now let me tell you a little story about him. This is Nikolai Bukharin. Nikolai Bukharin was the favorite of the party. Now, the party had been in existence for quite a while. People here who are more familiar with Russian history can fill in the details for you. But basically, there was a Russian Marxist named Plekhanov who was kind of the leader. And around 1906 or so, I might have that date slightly wrong, there's a big meeting in Russia about the Social Democratic Party. And what happened is Lenin gets Plekhanov to sign with him. And it's the only time that Lenin's group was the majority, which is the term Bolshevik, as opposed to the Mensheviks, which is the minority. But the Social Democratic Party was overwhelmingly what would be called Mensheviks, actually. But he had his revolutionary cadre. And they were very, very well organized. All right? Now, they got sent into exile, and Bukharin was the leading intellectual of this group. Okay? And they took seriously their studies. Like if you read Lenin's own book on the extent of industrial development in Russia, it's a very, very serious work in economic history. It's not just propaganda. I have Lenin's collected works. They take up 5 shelves, you know. It's huge. Stalin, by the way, wasn't much of an intellectual. But Bukharin was, Trotsky was. They were very intellectual guys. And he was the top gun, okay, of this. And his father-in-law was the leading economist prior to him, right? So he in 1914 gets sent to Vienna, and he lives in Vienna. And so does Stalin, by the way. Stalin is studying the nationalities question. That was an assignment given to him by Lenin. But he wrote a book, it's actually before 1914, it was published in 1914, on the Austrian School of Economics. And the reason why he writes that book is because in the 1890s, the famous Austrian economist, Eugene von Bavarick, had written a book called Karl Marx and the Close of His System, which was considered the single greatest critique of Marx. Okay? And von Bavarick's book is the reason why there's so few Marxists in economics departments. All right, why they went into sociology, history, and places like that, is because von Bavarick lays out what's called basically the marginal productivity theory of wage distribution, which is the critique of this exploitation theorem. And so you'd have to deny the teachings of neoclassical economics in some sense to get the kind of story that Marx was trying to tell. And von Bavarick lays that all out and shows the contradictions and efforts to try to get that idea. So Bukharin is sent. You got to refute these guys, right? Remember, they're intellectuals, so go and refute these guys. And so Bukharin writes this book. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this story is because in 1921, when he makes his retreat, he acknowledges the Austrians, and he says, look, for right now, they are right. He calls Ludwig von Mises the most learned economist in the world. And he is right, but we'll have the last laugh. You always have to remember. They believe that it was a ripeness issue. They made it a ripeness issue. That our culture wasn't quite ready yet. And now we're going to make the culture come about by holding on to the commanding heights, which is why their policy, I'll get to in a second, cared about holding on to the commanding heights of industry, why they allowed a lot of economic activity take place outside of those commanding heights. And he's going to come back. But the fact is that he recognizes this. The adoption of NEP was a collapse of our illusions. We thought then that our peacetime policy would be a continuation of the centralized planning of that period. In other words, war communism was seen not as military, as needed at a given stage of civil war, but as a universal, general, so to speak, normal form of economic policy victories. So go back to those policies that I was mentioning before. They were the normal policies. That's by the architect himself. So again, not a Western source criticizing, right, but by the people themselves. And so here he is in 1925, and he writes a policy called Concerning the New Economic Policy, and his idea to the peasants, for those of you who were at my earlier talk, this was Bukharin's recognition that you had to generate incentive-compatible policies. And his incentive-compatible policies was, hey, farmers, enrich yourselves. Okay, enrich yourselves. Now, that cost him dearly in the subsequent history. So what were these policies? First, we're going to have a fixed tax rather than an arbitrary tax. So I say to you, you got to give me 10%. I don't say, give me whatever you have. So now you have an incentive to do what? Produce, because you know you're going to give 10%, and you're not going to have it. What are you going to do if I could take anything? What do you think farmers did? Nothing. Well, not only did they do nothing, but whatever they had, they ate. So the practice was a kind of a storming practice, which is they hear that the Red Army's coming over, so they slaughtered all their cows and ate them or whatever while they were going before the army showed up, where they just had carcasses, right? Because they weren't going to just give it over to them, right? And so we got to change that policy. But if I say to you, look, when I come, I'm only going to take 10%, right? You're going to say, okay, well then I'll produce more, right? Because, right, I'm going to try to get more and more of that surplus. And if I'm only giving you 10%, okay, fine. At least I knew it wasn't arbitrary. So that was the first policies. Second, partial repeal of nationalization. This is a little bit funky because what they did was the same thing they did during the privatization in the 1990s, which was mixed ownership got counted as privatizing. So if a municipality owns something and then they say, oh, by the way, you can come in and be private owner and be manager, then we say, oh, we privatized it. But really, we didn't. It's still the municipalities. It's just that you're sharing the profits of the municipality, right? This is what they did with, in a lot of ways, what became the commanding heights kind of idea. So there's mixed ownership forms. Encourage agricultural productivity and encourage middlemen and profit seeking, the netmen. Remember how one of the laws was they were going to persecute the people that were taking food from the agricultural sector and bringing it into the city? Well, now we're not going to do that anymore. And we're going to allow you to come in and then buy low, sell high, and make a profit. But we're still going to condemn profits, but we're going to allow you to have it. That creates a kind of very strange position here. So yet you have the commanding heights and industrial production. So we privatized 85% of the Russian economy. Remember, it was nationalized all the way down to people had firms with 5 employees. So now we got rid of that. We privatized 85%. But the remaining 15% of industrial commanding heights employed close to 80% of the workforce. So the state controlled the main sectors of the economy. That's important for the leap forward later on. They had price controls on grain, because grain was considered to be too important of a product. You have confusing property rights and business activity. So the netmen, this is in a book called Utopia and Power, describe the netmen as being able to enjoy material comfort but live constantly in fear. Because profits are condemned. So at any time, the profits can in fact be eradicated and confiscated. So they're going back and forth there. And Boris Pasternak describes this in Dr. Zhivago as the most ambiguous and hypocritical of all Soviet periods. Right? This is the net period of time. So if I was to do a little game here, and I mean by that game structure, this is right up your alley, Tim, all right, is that basically what you have is a credibility game that's going on in which you make an announcement that you're going to liberalize, but in a sequentially rational way, the regime can cheat on the agreement, right? So you have a game tree, and you have a node, and at node 1, you make an announcement to liberalize, but at node 2, you can make an announcement or decision to renege. And since it's sequentially rational for you to renege, in node 1, you choose to do what? Stay out of the official economic game. So you stay in the black market. You develop all of those kind of things, like the drug market, right? I used to teach in New York. I used to have to walk through Washington Square Park every day, all right? Someone would always be sitting there going, psst, whatever you want, okay? So at the time, they were talking about banning trans fats in New York City. Eventually, they banned the big gulp, right? So they were talking about this, and I used to say to my students, I'll tell you this much, they ban trans fats. Tomorrow morning, there's going to be a guy sitting in the park. He's going to have a trench coat, and he's going to go, meatloaf, red gravy, brown gravy, whatever you want, right? It's not like meatloaf's going to disappear from the market, right? Just like any of these other things. And I'll tell you this much, if they make an announcement and they say, from now on, all trading in meatloaf is legal. But when you walk through the park, the guy's still sitting there saying, psst, meatloaf. You should think, what's wrong with that legalization of meatloaf? Something's a little funky. So this is what was going on here. All acts between capitalist consenting adults was legal, but yet somehow they were still trying to stay outside of view of the government. So something was wrong, right? They were fearful for their lives, and this is this point that's being made right here, all right? The most ambiguous and hypocritical of all Soviet periods. And they were right, because NEP was reversed, and the NEP men were taken care of. Okay? So, 1, it never was the regime's intention to continue to sustain NEP. That just wasn't their intentions. It was ideological unease with the NEP and the NEP men. So the system was destined. Contradictions of NEP. It had incentive incompatibilities. There's an instability of intervention. This is in the story of the price controls on grain, right? So I'll give you a story not from the 1920s, but from closer to your time in the 1990s. In 1992, they decided to liberalize prices. Okay? You're going to liberalize all prices, but not milk, because milk's essential. So we can't have liberalization of milk. Well, if you're a dairy producer, what can you do? The same thing that you get milk, you can make butter and sour cream with. So what are you going to do? If you can't fetch, you have to fetch a pre-collapse price for milk, but you can fetch a market-going price for butter and sour cream. Which did you decide to produce? Sour cream, not milk. So as a result, all of a sudden, there's no milk on the shelves, but there's a boatload of sour cream. So then how did the government choose to respond? Putting controls on quantities. You farmers, you have to produce so much milk at such a rate. All right? And so as a result, you went from, a factoid of where in the February, April time of 1992, you had, or 93, 93, you had all goods were liberalized except for 14 agricultural products, to where in August of 1993, the entire agricultural market was once again under state control. All during a period of market romanticism. All right? These terms get a little goofy, by the way, since you're studying the history of Russia. They also say between 1992, the ruble changed for $1 at 180 rubles to $1. By 1995, it was over 5,000 rubles to $1. All right? Okay? People claim that was during the age of monetarism. All right, step back. That's a nice little phrase, age of monetarism. What did Milton Friedman actually say? Right? MV equals PQ. Hyperinflation is not part of monetarism. It's a very strict kind of, formula about what you're supposed to do to equate the equation of exchange. Okay? So what was going on is Gerashenko and the other central bankers were just printing money like mad during that period of time. That's the opposite of monetarism. All right? And so that's not, monetarism wasn't adopted. There's a great debate on PBS, on the NewsHour, between Stephen Cohen and Jeffrey Sachs. And Jeffrey Sachs says, we have 100 years of economic theory about, the sort of, monetarism, and we understand that if you double the money supply, you're going to double the price level. And Stephen Cohen retorted, says, you might have 100 years of economic theory, but I have 1,000 years of Russian history. And and Sachs looks at him like, what the hell are you talking about? And I was sitting there like this. I was like, op-ed. And I wrote a whole op-ed about it. Anyway, but it's right that the way in which cultural values can shape these things, but the economic logic is still there. You double the money supply, you're going to double the price level. All right, that's not monetarism, okay? And yet this is the kind of period of time during that. Well, same thing was happening during the net period. They had a crisis at the time which was called the price scissors crisis, which is they didn't understand the exchange relationships between the town and the country. But yet at the same time, they were controlling the price of grain. So that's why you had the price scissors, was because of the interventions in the grain market. All right? So normally you would see rates of return equate across economies or, right, in the right way, but not when you start interfering with it, which is what they did. So you have this, and then these interventions beget other interventions. And then the final thing is this regime uncertainty and the inability to get a credible commitment. Now, Lenin Dies, one of my favorite propaganda films, pictures, is Lenin and Stalin in Gorky Park. Okay? Now, there's a statue. It has Stalin sitting with his arm around Lenin. If you actually look at the picture under which that statue is made, I guarantee when you were in kindergarten, you could do a better pasting job, okay? Because the hand is like this, like, he wasn't there, okay? Now, what Lenin did was Lenin wrote a letter, and he kind of attacked Bukharin, Trotsky, and Stalin in this letter. And he said, Stalin can't be the leader because he's too rude, okay? Trotsky can't be the leader because he's too ambitious. And Bukharin can't be the leader because he's too much of an academic, right? He sits there and reflects on the world. So Lenin did the worst of all possible things. He kind of figured a way that they could maybe all rule together. All right? So this is like three brothers who are vying for the power seat of the dad, and they're going to chop each other's heads off. Okay? Now, Stalin is actually the least accomplished of these three. Right? He's actually literally like the guy who took notes, at the meeting. He was like, and if you read the history of this, Bukharin was very athletic, and he was a wrestler, and he used to like wrestle Joe and make fun of him and everything like that because Joe wasn't too strong, and all this stuff, and he got paid back for that, and then some. But what happened is a very simple thing. Remember the snowball and Napoleon and the windmill? Well, that was the deal. Trotsky wanted to industrialize the economy and go away from NEP, go back to hardcore communism and industrialize the entire system. Bukharin was deathly afraid of this move. He's like, oh my God, we just went through that. It's going to collapse. We're not ready to do it. So he sided with Stalin to fight Trotsky. So Trotsky gets kicked out and has to go away. But as soon as he gets kicked out, remember that Bukharin is making statements to defeat Trotsky which make him sound like a member of the bourgeoisie. Enrich yourselves, right? We need private property rights. We need markets, all these things like that. And so what happened was Stalin flips and says that he's now in favor of the industrialization. And they purge. So for those of you who have ever read revolutionary thinking, there's what you call right-wing deviationism and left-wing deviationism. And Trotsky was accused of left-wing deviationism, but then Bukharin was accused of right-wing deviationism. And during this period between 1924 and 1928, this battle's going on. And then if you want to get a sense of the revolution, again, for the broad idea here, there's a fantastic book by Arthur Koestler called Darkness at Noon, which is what goes through the mind of a revolutionary, a true believer, right? Because in Bukharin's case, for example, he actually is safely in Paris, but he comes back, right? And then he's executed. All right, you have to understand, go back to the quote, their dreams, everything that they've done in their life is wrapped up in this, and it's collapsing in front of their whole minds or whatever. And so that's a big issue. So what you have is this power struggle, and then Stalin sort of comes in. The guise of this intellectually is the industrialization debate. And now you have the bloodiest murderer of the 20th century, probably. Well, Mao might do him better. All right, so Mao might be better here. But he's from 1928 to 1953. The Purge, which is this purge right in the late 20s, beginning of the 30s. You have 7 million people arrested, 1 million executed. They had show trials. So a very, very bad episode in the 20th century, including the United States. Okay? The New York Times correspondent to Russia was basically bought off by Stalin and said the show trials were an example of democracy at work. Okay? The collectivization, which is the collectivization of farms, the loss of the kulaks, 1.8 million. This includes largely in Ukraine. Kulaks is a word for middle class. So this is important, by the way, because the Soviet mass murders are not considered genocide because the UN determined after World War II that genocide was for race and religion, but not for economic classes. And so the Soviet crimes against humanity do not have the same public attention as others, precisely because we defined it out of existence. But the dekulakization, which is the exact quote of the term, is in fact I just had someone just try to say that Soviet gulags weren't that cruel. Okay, and that's nonsense. All right, the gulag, 40 to 50 million Soviet citizens served sentences in the gulag. They estimate about 10% of them died. So these are not dying from war, they're not dying from natural causes, they're dying from a system that put them in these situations. And then finally, this is even worse, this is the Ukrainian famine. This is death by hunger. The Red Cross was there, and Stalin refused to allow the Red Cross, had the Red Army block the Red Cross from going in to help. So this is a tremendous crime against humanity. So you have to understand that. That's a big part of the learning about the history of Russia. By the way, Russia is really weird because they actually, are there Russians here? Yeah. So if you go visit Moscow, like you guys are going to go, you'll go see St. Basil's Cathedral. It's beautiful architect. And Ivan the Terrible, had the eyes poked out of the architect afterwards so that he could never create anything so beautiful again. And they're going to show you a bell outside the Kremlin wall where Ivan the Terrible had the tongue slashed out of the bell, which it doesn't have a thing, because these were two brothers that tried to do a revolution, and the way they tortured him was they would torture the one to try to get him to confess to the other, and so, chop his arm off, and then the brother say, no, I'm not telling, and then this one, and so then they, did all these things. And they just, it's a very kind of a strange thing because this is just part of the history of it, and we have our own picadillos, really bad history. We are past imperfect to the max, but we don't put it in the Foder's Guide, right? So you don't get the Foder's Guide for a traveler and go there and then read about that, right? So and there you would. All right, so what was the empirical record of socialism? 1, economic backwardness, lack of economic development and growth, declining standards of living. The Soviet system, by the way, is the only industrialized system that experienced a decline in life expectancy from 1960 to 1985. Life expectancy declined during that period of time, not increased. All right, Political tyranny, one-party dictatorship, suppression of political dissent, oppression of civil liberties, religious and artistic freedom is driven underground. You guys are all too young, but when Yuri Andropov became the new head of the Soviet government, originally everyone was like, we might be able to work with him because he listens to jazz music. That actually was a phrase there. And as you know, Bush thought that Putin he could talk to because Putin worshipped Christianity during the regime. An overall decline in human well-being. There's a Murray Feshbik, who's a professor at Georgetown, writes about econocide, which is the ecology effects of communism. And it's very, very telling to do that. But it affects population, pollution of water, nutrition, living space, health, and life expectancy. So why does socialism pursue so poorly? And what does this great social experiment of the 20th century tell us? Well, again, like I said, we have three hypotheses. I'm sure there's many more that we could put up there. But one of them is bad leaders. But the question you have to ask is, why is the performance so bad everywhere that it has been attempted? The kind of record that I put up about the Soviet system is not something that I could also put up about if you go to the Czech Republic or in Prague. You can go into their Museum of Communism and see the number of people that were killed in Prague and the same kind of idea in this. So why is it everywhere that we see this? Hypothesis 2, historical circumstances. But as I said, Russia was the 5th largest industrial economy and certainly more developed than France. So I want to say it's an economic system that cannot work. The absence of property means that the system has distorted incentives. The inability to use prices as guides means that information is distorted and confusing. The lack of profit and loss means that there's no incentive for innovation and there's no discipline. And politics means that you don't have the institutional infrastructure to provide for the civil liberties and human liberties that you expect out of a modern functioning social system. And so as a result, you have economic deprivation and political tyranny. As a result from this message should be understood. It's vital for us today as what we learned from the 20th century. And unfortunately, it's a message that doesn't get taught enough. So thank you very much. And it's my final quote. And I think we have some time for questions or no? Do we have time?
3 to 4 minutes.
Okay, I apologize for taking up so much of your time, but this is my final quote, which is that humanity didn't fail to live up to the ideals of socialism. Socialism as a doctrine failed to live up to the demands of humanity. But,
Take maybe 2 questions.
yep. Someone's got to ask me a question. Yes, sir.
I know people in Russia that they are trying to start businesses, and in the 90s and today, they had been going to business pretty well, and I said to them, why don't you expand? And like your net of people who are afraid to join, the Putin seems to be allowing capitalism to flourish, yet people are afraid. They don't want their business to be big. They say, if my business gets big, I'll be on the radar, and I'll be either killed or it'll be stolen or something bad will happen. So it appears that similar thing is happening in Russia, kind of in a different way. Is that
So I would say that you should divide the Putin regime. I'll defer to you on this, but I think that you should divide the Putin regime into 2 periods. Before the Khodorkovsky affair and after the Khodorkovsky affair. So prior to the Khodorkovsky affair, he was very much for open markets, development, things like that. But what happened was one of the very successful businessmen then became someone who could challenge him politically. And what he did was he used all the power of the state that he could to crack down on this guy and eliminate him as a competitor. At least that's in my interpretation. And after that, you get the kind of freeze on, what you're talking about. And so again, it's still an economy that's based on connections more than contracts. And for the people in here, that's the main idea that you want to think about, is whether or not an economic system is a connection-based system or a contract-based system. Is how you get ahead is because of your own merit, that would be a contract-based system, or do you get ahead only because you have connections? Most of human history is connection-based, and with the consequences that economic development is thwarted. All right, because contract-based allows for anonymous exchange, for the expansion of the array of trading partners and everything like that. And so to the extent that the trust isn't in face-to-face, but in an institution, you're going to get wider growth and development, refinements of the division of labor. So I think in there what they did was they stultified the environment because of what happened in that affair. And that the legacy of that is continued. Yes?
1917, Russia is pretty much hurting after World War I. And you're also replacing the form of government. The monarch is out. Would any system have done well?
It's a great question. We try to control for that in the way that you look at the data there. But you're right. I mean, this is so. It's kind of an interesting dialogue up until the time you get Lenin. So, you know, could the cadet party have gone? You know, there's a guy named let me see if I'm testing my history now. My Alexander Herzen, right, is the leader of the cadet party, I think, and they're kind of a liberal party, like liberal in the European sense, and so maybe but they couldn't hold the coalition. So yes, they're hurting all economies in the war after these kind of situations are hurting. I mean, that's a kind of a counterfactual that would be a good one to think about. I tend to think that a regime that believed in property. So again, it's comparing apples and oranges, okay? But take a look at the United States after World War II. Right? In the United States, during World War II, we got up to an economy where basically the government was around 60%, right, of what was going on in terms of control. All right? And then we got rid of all of that, and we didn't suffer a depression. Right? Remember, all the predictions after World War II was that we were going to suffer this tremendous stagnation because now all this government spending wasn't going to happen anymore. And yet what we did was they unleashed markets, and that didn't happen. All the Keynesian dire predictions were proven wrong. And the market recovered and we sort of moved on. So I tend to think of economies that have firm establishment of property rights, have sound money, fiscal responsibility, open themselves up to trade. So you have, you know, part of the problem in the Soviet bloc and the post-Soviet bloc is that they didn't have supply chains outside of their existing system. So that's why, remember my joke about state shortage of buns and a state shortage of sausage leads to a sandwich sold out the back window. They couldn't get sausage or buns from another source other than within the system. Whereas once you open the system up, you're now going to have what? Sausages and buns and salami and everything else coming from all over the world to your place. So you have to allow trade liberalization, and then you get the resources will flow there. And so I tend to think economies can kind of bounce back really quickly. There's a passage in John Stuart Mill, which I understand that it's a passage is not the same thing as truth or evidence, but Mill says the great rapidity with which countries bounce back from war, famine, earthquake, all this stuff, you know, within a generation, as long as you allow for the free flow of labor and capital. What happens is we don't allow for the free flow of labor and capital, the system gets gummed up, and then it doesn't recover. And so that's what I think is going on here. But it's a great question. I want to thank everyone. Thank you very much.